Hi, I'm Carol Tracy, and I'm the director of the Women's Law Project. We're a public interest law center located in Pennsylvania. Our office is in Philadelphia. And for 42 years, we have been doing work to improve the legal, economic, social, and health status of women and their families in Pennsylvania and in the nation. So our work has involved high-impact litigation on areas like reproductive rights. We've done a great deal of public policy work on violence against women, and we engage in community education in a variety of forums. I first learned about trauma when I was doing legal work on behalf of adult survivors of sexual assault. And the work we were doing was trying to extend the statute of limitations so that adults who had recovered memories of their sexual assault would be able to bring litigation. Now, it was very hard to explain why they recovered their memories. And that's when I learned about trauma, and that's when I learned about traumatic amnesia. And I learned how powerful the impact of trauma was on people's entire bodies, their minds as well as their bodies. And that very often people who had been sexually assaulted as children started having flashbacks and started recovering their memories as adults. And that was very important evidence for me to present in these legal proceedings. So that's how it began, but it also became clear to me because we do so much work on behalf of vulnerable women that traumatic amnesia wasn't the only issue we were talking about here. We were talking about the overall impact of trauma in women's lives. So at the same time, I was doing work on behalf of pregnant women who were illegally arrested and incarcerated for using drugs while they were suffering from untreated substance use disorders. And again, we found that they had histories of sexual assault and domestic violence. And while it didn't exonerate some of their behavior, it certainly explained it. And it explained how important treatment was, and that treatment needed to be trauma-informed. If one doesn't understand the histories and the presenting underlying issues connected with adult behavior that becomes dysfunctional, such as addiction, then one's never going to be able to treat it. We had to get to the underlying issues. So I learned that. I learned it mostly from Sandra Bloom. I started reading her work, and then I met her. She became actually a plaintiff in some of the litigation that we were doing when she was the president of the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies. But it was also very clear to me that it was important for the larger community to know this, the community that was working with vulnerable women, the domestic violence community, the sexual assault community, legal services that work with so many women who are impoverished, and impoverished in some ways because of their past histories, women who were homeless. So Sandra Bloom very graciously agreed to do a series of seminars for us for free. And you know, I think the first one we had maybe 30 people who attended, and once the word got out, there were 80 people and then standing room only for these seminars that really helped us understand what this behavior is about. It was one thing, for example, for me to say in a brief, they've got histories of sexual assault and domestic violence. Well, okay, but what does that mean? What are the behavioral implications of it? And I think what we learned the most, which was so important, which is that trauma is an injury, and people can heal from injuries. And that is what we wanted to tell the court, but it's also what we wanted our own community to understand. As time has gone on, I've been doing a significant amount of work around law enforcement's response to sexual assault. And one of the issues that has baffled law enforcement over the years, apart from some significant gender bias they have around issues of sexual assault and domestic violence, what's baffled them frequently is the the behavior of women they see when they're interviewing them, because they expect them to be hysterical or have a tremendous affect, and they don't understand trauma. They don't understand the neurobiology of trauma. They don't understand that no two victims act alike. Just because one isn't crying or screaming doesn't mean one hasn't been seriously injured and harmed. So that's been very important for us to know. It's been very important for us in working with law enforcement to understand that. And I think that in general, throughout our health and human services systems in Philadelphia, as well as our law enforcement systems, we are beginning to understand and develop policies that are appropriately connected to trauma and the impact of trauma on people's behavior and the understanding that healing can occur. Some of the policies that we have implemented is making sure, for instance, in some of our domestic violence and sexual assault programs, that any therapeutic interventions that are there are interventions that understand trauma. We talk about how the police need to interview and not interrogate victims. We talk about policies that do not make decisions simply based on someone's notion about how a person is supposed to react who has suffered from trauma. And I think more and more we're looking at how we need to intervene so much earlier with children who have been exposed to their own violence, or even the violence in their household and in their community. That it has an impact. It has an impact on learning. It has an impact on behavior. So there have been a variety of programs throughout the city that, at first I think we just started introducing the notion, and then I think programs who have become sanctuary certified programs are really diving deep into it to make sure that their organizational structure, as well as their interventions with their clients, are appropriately trauma-informed. The people who came to the seminars that Dr. Bloom offered were mostly lawyers. They were lawyers who were working in a variety of public interest organizations. They could be working for Community Legal Services, Philadelphia Legal Assistance, Women Against Abuse Legal Center, homeless advocacy, and more than occasionally, also most of those programs have social workers who were working with them. So it was their lawyers and social workers. And in many respects, I think that it helped integrate the legal practice with the social work practice in public interest law. The necessary next steps in Philadelphia, I think, is to dive deeper. I think that what we worry about a little bit is that the word trauma-informed is overused. And if a person has gone to one training session or one seminar, that they therefore are trauma-informed. And it's considerably more complex than that. So I think that we need to do a deeper dive within our own organizations and systemically. I think we're in that process. I think that we've been doing this for 10 or 15 years, and I think that we're getting closer to understanding it. I think we're understanding also how hard it is for service providers or law enforcement personnel to really deal with the kind of vile behavior that they've seen human beings do to other human beings. It's really hard. I mean, I review police files every year. The Women's Law Project and a group of other organizations do an audit of our sex crimes files where we look at child abuse and adult sexual abuse. And I'm reading paper, and I find it incredibly difficult. And I just imagine how hard it is for the police officers who are doing this work. I've gotten renewed respect. I came in when we first started working in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Police Department around how we believe they were mishandling sexual assault cases, come in sort of guns a-blazing of you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong, you're doing the other wrong. And indeed, they were doing a lot of it wrong, so they began their own self-correction, but I also began to understand in a very visceral way how hard it is. And I think we have to take that into consideration. I think we know that vicarious trauma is real, and that organizational trauma is also, which is why I think the sanctuary model is probably one of the most important interventions we have in Philadelphia that really examines the organization as well as the individual treatment plan. Dig deeper means that you really need to look at your organizational structure. You need to examine your behavior. You need to look at the impact it's having on you, the impact it's having on your clients. You need to read a little bit. You need to understand the research more. And you need to be really committed to healing. I think the most important message that I've ever learned about trauma is that you can heal from it. And healing is an incredibly important notion for our city. And it's something that's doable, and it's hard, and it's hard work. I think Philadelphia is a truly informed, trauma-informed city in 10 or 15 years. I think we will see considerably less street violence. I think we will see considerably less violence in the home. Of course, both of those issues are greatly connected. I think we will see happier people. That's what I think a trauma-informed city will look like. I think we have a particular lens. The Women's Law Project obviously has a particular lens, which is the legal lens. But I think anybody who was working seriously with women has to, at some point, recognize trauma and stand up. I mean, leadership is very important, the Women's Law Project is unique in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania as the only legal organization devoted exclusively to improving the status of women. And of course, I want to add, when one develops public policy that is responsive to women, men are helped as well. It's when public policy is only geared towards men that women, particularly pregnant women, get left out of the picture. So if the umbrella's big enough to cover pregnant women, it's going to cover men as well, because we know men are traumatized. There's enough data to show us how many young boys are sexually assaulted and otherwise brutalized in their communities or in their homes, and frequently grow up and reenact the behavior. We need to be responsive to that, and we need to help them as well. So I think that whatever we do in Philadelphia, I think if one spends the time to really understand the clients that you're working with, whether it's a lawyer. Let me tell you, Community Legal Services, their family advocacy unit, after the very first seminar with Sandy Bloom, they pulled her in. They knew immediately that their clients needed, and their lawyers needed to know what the underlying research and issues and treatment needs were of their clients. So I think that when people are exposed to it, whether it's the lens of law or the lens of social work or the lens of other kinds of policy initiatives, then leadership emerges. Because what I've always been amazed at is the sort of common sense that's connected with being trauma-informed. And I used to sort of marvel at both the seminars that we did, but other seminars that I attended, for instance, that BH10 put on, that it didn't matter if there was a psychiatrist sitting in the room, a very well-educated psychiatrist, or a CAC counselor with much limited education. everyone left the room thinking differently. And, you know, in some respects, I think that has a lot to do with the talent of Sandra Bloom as an educator, but I think it's also because there is something that is simply logical and commonsensical, has common sense connected with the study of trauma. Actually, one of the other issues that we're starting to look at now, which is very different, which is how to make legal proceedings more trauma-informed. You know, treatment programs, mental health programs, substance abuse treatment programs, a variety of other social service interventions, they've always been designed to help people. Now, they might not have, but that's their purpose. Legal proceedings are inherently adversarial. There are winners and losers. There's cross-examination. And we have found, and I think it's apparent to everyone, that even if you're the winner in a legal proceeding, whether it's a criminal proceeding or a civil proceeding, whether it has anything to do with trauma, sometimes the impact of going through the trauma alone, even if you get the outcome you want, going through the legal proceedings, I mean, are traumatic. So there's a question that I have now is there a way that we can still serve justice and understand that it is an adversarial system, that there's some weighing of evidence and balancing and a decision about who wins and who loses, who's right, who's wrong. But to see if we could do it in a way that isn't as traumatic, isn't so traumatic as it is now. And that's particularly true, I think, in legal proceedings involving children and involving these very sensitive issues connected with sexual assault and domestic violence. So that's my next project, trying to see if we could do some work in that area as well. I have some judges who I think are very, very interested because I think they're also understanding. I mean, they need to, judges really do need to understand sort of trauma 101 and 210 and all of that, but and I'm not even suggesting that most of them do. But they also have to, if they're willing to, come to the table to say, let's see if we can also, in general, do something a little different. I guess the one thing I'll say about campus sexual assault, what we're seeing with campus sexual assault is something that's really quite extraordinary. I've been doing work for over 40 years in this area, including starting my work in many respects related to rape on campus. And what I see going on now, which I think is a huge paradigm shift, a cultural shift, is that we are seeing women who have been victimized by rape, throwing down the shackles of shame and stigma that's normally accompanied by rape. Rape victims usually don't want their names in public. Newspapers don't publish the names of rape victims, not because of any feminist demands, but because newspapers have historically acknowledged the shame that rape brought to the family of the rape victim. So it's really been terribly stigmatized. And you see these young women on college campuses who, many of them, these very prestigious schools and Ivy League schools, who are just saying, I'm not ashamed. This isn't my fault. They're showing their faces, they're using their names, and sort of in the history of the world, that's a big deal. That's really a big deal, and I can't help but believe that that is not part of a culture that is understanding trauma and is understanding shame and stigma. So I think that part of the reason it's exciting to be in Philadelphia now is that there are so many people from so many disciplines who are coming to the table to figure out how to make our society, our city, our homes, our communities less violent. And I think that we're on the precipice of something really big and something important happening in the world we live in, even though I think we feel on a day-to-day basis that we are just consumed, if not subsumed, by violence.